will keep coming, and as and are also with us over on the Facebook side of things. But we should begin to everyone who is with us from all the various places, certainly in this part of North America, but also elsewhere. On behalf of everyone at Elliott Bay Book Company, which is on Duwamish land in the city of Seattle, and Kip Robinson Greenthal and Elizabeth Austen and everyone else who's with us. We are so delighted and so thrilled to be having this evening with Kip for her newly published debut novel, Shoal Water. I should preface that by saying, I mean, because I have mentioned this kind of comment before, but in 35 years plus of doing these evenings and these programs, which until for the first 33 plus years were in person, there's two kinds of programs like this that give us sort of the deepest joy, which is not to take anything away from any other. One is when we have writers from far, far away in the world, and that's happening even more in a different way on Zoom, where you can't believe you're in the same presence as this writer who's written possibly in another language from far away, and yet there's this connection, and their book is part of it. I mean, it's not just them, but it's the book. The other thrill and the other deep joy is when you see people from here, very much of our place and our time and our work days or our living days, who some of whom you never knew had this going on, this being the writing of a book or the writing that is being done that becomes a book. And this book tonight, this evening with Kip, falls a little bit into that latter place where we are thrilled, and there's a journey to how this book got written. There's a journey to how it got published. It's published by press Homebound Publications here in the Northwest, and other various people have had a hand in helping Kip get there. But and that's true of any writer, I would say, who gets a book out. I mean, their name's on the book, but others are part of it in both the daily ways and sometimes those moments of grace, like somebody making this little introduction or connection. But this book of Kip's is one that is literally in hand. It's in our store. It's on our shelves. She came in today and signed copies of it. So with tonight, though, I'm giving a little bit sort of a circular around the book story, but you will get to hear more of the story of the book from Kip and from Elizabeth. Kip, of course, for so many years has been doing so much to help others writing and help others appreciate others writing, working probably most visibly and notably for Sail Arts and Lectures and starting their writers in the school programs, and those programs which won awards under her leadership and have continued on in her wake of her role, has certainly been a national model for working with writers, and in turn they're working with students. She's done that. She's done other writing along the way, had story collections or story, not collection, but stories published. And underlying this whole story is this book, Shoal Water, which is a novel not set here, but it is set, as you will hear, and not all you would yet know or guess, in Nova Scotia, a certain time in recent but not immediate past U.S. history, or actually the central character goes up to from the east coast of the U.S. up to Nova Scotia, and it's during a time of great tumult in this country, which what we've been going through more recently is a reminder of, and certainly in many ways, I think you'll read it, you feel this is a certain time some decades ago, but it also has great resonance now. So Kip will be with Elizabeth doing some back and forth. You'll get to hear Kip read, you'll get to hear them converse. And Elizabeth Austen, I think she and Kip have had some history with this book and probably some working history together as well. Elizabeth, of course, has been as a wonderful poet, was a former Washington State Poet Laureate, for years had a great pieces on KUOW with poetry. I mean, you'd hear at a time when poetry hasn't always had a public place. Elizabeth has been a great advocate and presence where that's concerned. And she continues to do wonderful work on and around with poetry and language. The other thing I'll say about Kip's book, back to Kip. This book actually received a publication prize, a landmark prize for being published. So saying she's a prize-winning author as her first book is newly in the world is apt. So tonight, the two, they will have their say. I mean, we kept reading and Elizabeth conversing, but we hope, besides the wonderful comments you've been putting in the chat, you will ask questions too. And toward the end of the hour, Elizabeth will read from those, and that'll be part of the conversation she and Kip have. And then I'll come back. I'm about to disappear, and I'll come back at the end to help send this all off into the night. The thing, of course, we're missing is for all the distances and various islands and other countries that people are here from, we're obviously not having in-person presence. And so sometime down the road, we'll get Kip to back down where we'll try and do something in person to kind of make that happen. But instead, you do get this amazing feeling of people really all from all over. And so we hope you'll celebrate with Kip tonight, raise a glass or a cup or whatever is appropriate in celebration of her having this book come out. I think she's going to do a little going out afterwards because she won't get to hug and greet all of you afterwards, but except your comments in the chat help with that. And I think I'm going to step away now and turn this over to those who should be the ones you'll hear from now. So please, after thanking you all again for being with us, join in giving the best virtual attention and the best virtual applause to Kip Robinson Greenthal, to Shoal Water, and to Elizabeth Austen. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Rick. Honestly, when you said the word 35 years, that's how many years this book has been in my imagination, been in my mind. And I want to say that this book couldn't come into the world without the incredible support of independent bookstores like Elliott Bay Books. It couldn't come out into the world without the support of a literary icon like you, Rick, and Karen Allman. Karen's behind the scenes, but she is a true, wonderful supporter of many authors who've come to Seattle from all over the world. I want to shout out a thanks to my publicist, Mary Bisbee Beek, who arranged this evening, and a huge gratitude to Leslie Browning of Homebound Publications, who honored me with the Landmark Prize and offered a publishing contract. And I especially want to thank my dear friend and former Washington State Poet Laureate, Elizabeth Austen, who has held my hand and guided me through the process of having my first virtual reading and interview to launch Shoal Water. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thrilled to do it, Kip.
So Elizabeth and I chatted, and I think what I'll do is I'm going to just start with a quick little synopsis of Shoal Water. And then there's the first chapter on my website. So I decided not to read from that. I'm going to just tell you a little bit of what the story is, and then read passages from the three main characters. So disillusioned by the Vietnam War and troubled by their own past, Kate and Andy in 1971 leave New York City for a remote Nova Scotia fishing village where Andy spent summers as a child to build a new future. And as Kate and Andy settle into the barren Atlantic community and start a bookstore and begin to raise a family, they discover the problems of their own past are mirrored in the unrest of the locals who are grappling with change as modern technology threatens their traditional way of fishing. In their shared sense of place, Kate and Andy's lives become inextricably linked with the fate of Ivan, Will, and Lena, Nova Scotians, and a love triangle, a tragic accident, and alcoholism capsize their future. Shoal Water is a treacherous place, not out on the deep water and not on land. It's a place in between, full of unexpected hazards, submerged sandbars, diffracted waves, countercurrents, but it's also where the richest fishing lies. Shoal Water is also the unflinching account of a woman's passage out of dependence into self-possession as she navigates dangerous waters and gains power to redeem loss and find forgiveness. I'll begin reading from a chapter from which the title, Shoal Water, comes from. Andy remembered standing on the deck of Carl's boat that first summer, dressed in Ivan's two big yellow oilskins. It was the most beautiful morning he had ever seen, with the cove and dark air and the magenta light, dawn a pink line over the horizon. Even at 13, Andy knew that going out fishing in the early Nova Scotia morning was remarkable. "Welcome to your first fishing trip now, Andy," Carl yelled out. But Andy knew that Ivan was not welcoming him. They slid past the black rocks onto the swell of the ocean. Out on the water, things hadn't gone that easily. He'd found it hard to balance on deck. When he fell across the engine box, Ivan dismissed him with a look. But Carl had given him the wheel and shown him how to keep the Lena's bow lined up with the point of land while Ivan busied himself with the lines. "The tide's flooding, so we'll haul down with it. We'll reset the nets down from the shoals, you." Shoals? A word Andy had never heard before. A buoy bobbed ahead of them. Carl took over and slowed the Lena, and Ivan ran forward, leaned far out to grab it and slip the bow line through. Andy knew he'd never move with that same coordination. Carl cut the engine. The wind had died, and morning light shone through the green sea and swayed him. He remembered leaning over the gunwale to see the anchor line angling mysteriously down into the deep, and he felt as though he were glimpsing something primeval. The stern swung around, and a mass of silver fish flickered in the net. Something interrupted. Something was attacking the fish in their nets. "Damn seal," Carl called out, grabbing a spike pole and racing to the stern. Cursing, he took aim. Small whirlpools whipped by the float line, and Carl jabbed at them with the pole. "What is it?" Andy asked, surprised. "They eat fish," Ivan said. A shining black head rose in the water, looked right at Carl. The seal's whiskers flickered in the sun, its black eyes watery like a dog's. Andy had never seen one so close before, something looking so benevolent rising from the sea. Carl aimed his pole right between his eyes. "Carl, don't!" Ivan screamed. The seal disappeared. "Why the hell not, you?" "Don't kill it." Ivan's voice was steady. Everything grew silent then, even the movement of the sea as Andy stood with his feet planted on the deck, relieved by Ivan's outburst. Carl dropped the pole by his side. "What's gotten into you, Ivan?" "It's bad luck," Ivan said, looking out over the water. And Andy looked out too, fearing he might see the sea creature's body floating with warm blood on the ocean. But there was no sign of him. "Since when is it bad luck?" Carl spat into the water, wiping his mouth. "It's just a feeling," Ivan said, looking away. Andy pictured the seal underwater somewhere down deep, close to the seafloor, maybe 25 feet beneath the Lena. He imagined it escaping over the reef, darting for a deeper current. "Well, Andy, get your gloves, boy. We're going to show you how to pick herring." He got his gloves then, wrestled his fingers inside them. Ivan came up and pulled the rope, and Andy joined him. They hauled the net with herring trapped and tangled by their gills. "So this is how you shake fish now, Andy," Carl said. He took the net and the fish slithered onto the deck. He didn't know if it was the sea swell or the smell of fish, but suddenly he was dizzy and retching over the rail. Shit, weak, pathetic. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. He knew Ivan saw him, but Carl seemed not to notice. His throat was in knots while the boat rocked and seawater ran down his aching arms, and fish scales smeared his gloves and jacket, but he stood up again and picked and pitched fish into the boxes. "Your oilskins aren't looking so stiff now," Ivan said, and looked at him for the first time that morning. Later, when they'd finished cleaning up, they let the Lena drift while they sat eating sandwiches and passing back and forth a flask of rum. The sun was hot on their shoulders and the alcohol made Andy float. Seasickness is part of becoming a fisherman, Carl said, then reset his cap over his wiry gray hair. You'll get stronger. The sun cast showers of light in their eyes. Carl looked over at him. I'm going to tell you something, Carl said. It's about a dream I've had all my life. It's about the shoals that wake me up in the dead of night. What are shoals? Andy finally asked. The shallows, Carl said, where the seafloor comes up just beneath the surface of the sea. You can't see them easily, and you sure as hell try to stay off them, but the rich fishing ground lies right there. Carl took a swig of rum. I'm coming in from fishing, see, but I can't tell west from east, north from south, because the points of my compass don't register. I try to find the markers for the shoals, but the sky's as black as the sea, and I can't see nothing. I know the shoals are coming like a man can smell the warmth of another human being when his eyes are closed. But the difference is my eyes are wide open. The boat pitches beneath me, and I know I've come in by the shoal water. Fear, that's what I call the shoal water. Fear that you run aground and let the sea break over you. I figured that's what shoal water is, that fear inside me. And if I can feel the shallows coming in time, I can right myself and get through them. Andy took another swig of rum and looked over at Ivan for the first time, meeting his eyes.
Oh, thank you, Kip, for that introduction to the book. There's so much there that I'm looking forward to talking about with you, but we've really got to start by the question. So 35 years ago, this book began to take shape in you. What can you tell us about the inspiration for this novel? Where did it begin for you?
It began for me in Nova Scotia, and I worked at the Lunenburg Library for 9 years. And there was the story of a terrible accident at sea when a father took out his young son on the Cape Island boat. And the father, sadly, was alcoholic, was drunk, and left the cover of the engine box off. And the boy was thrown into the engine box and killed. And there was something about this story, this accident, that just possessed me. I couldn't really explain it. I think there was something about the whole concept of parental negligence, um, the concept of the tragedy of what can happen out on the sea, waves, countercurrents that toss the boat. And I knew this accident was somehow the beginning, the spark plug for this story. And in order to write it, I had to learn all about the characters who were in the story. Anybody tangential. I can't pronounce that word very well. And so that started me with the Nova Scotian characters. And then, Kate and Andy moving to Nova Scotia. But it truly is a work of fiction when something real spawns the idea, but then you kind of fabricate. It's what triggers, but it doesn't necessarily happen the way it happened in real life. But it's the way I met my characters.
Yeah. So you were living in Nova Scotia for like a decade or so, right? And so did you start the novel while you were living there?
I lived there for 12 years, and I probably wrote my first 2 pages in Nova Scotia. And it actually was Kate going down to the shore and looking in the ocean after her son was killed in this accident. And of course, it's totally different in the book now. I don't want to give anything away, but those are the first 2 pages I remember writing. And then I left Nova Scotia and actually moved to Lopez, where I stayed in my family home farm. And then it was there that I wrote more, but the working and raising of children, it was all intermittent. It wasn't like I had this wide, breadth of space and time to sit down and write the book. It was
That is
important.
fascinating that the seed came to you while you were living in Nova
Yeah.
Scotia, and you wrote those 2 pages, and then you had to leave there
Yeah.
to write the story that's set there.
Yeah,
Great.
that's true.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me because I think we can hear just even in that first excerpt how primal the landscape, or I guess I should say the seascape of Nova Scotia is to this book. And before I read Shoal Water, I had never heard that term Shoal Water before. The way you use it, or the way that term describes that that shallow place. And I'm curious about how you see that, those shoal waters. I mean, you ended up using the term for the title of the novel. How is that an important symbol in the book, or how do you see that influencing this novel and how it plays out?
Mhm. Well, I see shoal water as I described, or Carl, Ivan's uncle described. You get through those scary passages, those shallows that come up close to the sea surface. And what's ironic about that is it's where the fish are. It's the richest part for fishermen. So it's seeking something very powerful and rich, but also being in a dangerous place. And it's a place where rogue waves can manifest. And it's dangerous. But so I see shoal water as a love story. And so the metaphor lasts with the different relationships with the characters in the book being willing to go through those shoal waters in order to find, the rich fishing ground, the real love. And Stanley and I wrote a song together. Stanley wrote the music in 1986 while we were at Centrum, and I was writing away what I was working on. Stanley wrote the music, and we put our words together, and it was indeed a love story about getting through those shoal waters. The pearl is in my bow. I'm bringing it to you.
Mm. Well, that's a great segue for us to meet another character. Will you read us another excerpt?
Sure. So the next, I'm going to read from Kate's point of view. So Kate does she's crazy enough to go with Andy to Nova Scotia, not exactly on a whim, but she was raised by her mother with stories about Nova Scotia. Her mother went to Nova Scotia as a child to Bedeck, and they were some of her favorite memories as a child. And so that was kind of why Nova Scotia resonated for me when, as a writer, when Andy asked Kate to go to Nova Scotia. She had those memories that her mother was happy there. Her mother had died when she was 8, so she was very nostalgic about her mother, and it was a way of her kind of seeking out where her mother had been happy. So this is when they've been in Nova Scotia for several months. They were standing by the large window in the Tannard house looking toward the great width of the sea when Andy said, "Marry me, Kate. Please marry me." His voice was strong and Kate's heart stopped. A lifetime commitment. They'd gone to get their immigrant status and discovered it would be advantageous to be married. "I want to spend my life with you." Suddenly the space seemed small as Kate tried to imagine what a lifetime meant. She took a deep breath and wanted to believe that Andy was the right man for her. She heard her father's voice before she left for Nova Scotia. "You're not even married." "I will marry you," she said hastily, while a breeze came in through the room, and she knew that she had no idea what she wanted. Yes, maybe that is what I should do. They walked to the Tannard General Store, and Lena invited Kate to have some tea. "I hope it won't take you too long to feel at home in Slate Harbor," Lena said, with a faint sigh, getting up to fetch the boiling water. Lena, just to let you know, is Ivan's mother, wife of Will. She put 2 tea bags into a teapot and poured the water in. Coming back to sit, they listened to the rain, a veil of water coming down. To work here, Lena, we need to get our landed immigrant status, Kate blurted out, and it helps to get married. Married? Oh, Kate, that's wonderful. I hope, well, I imagine that's what you want. Yes, I think so. It feels inevitable to get married. She saw herself running the way she'd watched the grasses flow through the truck window coming to Nova Scotia with Andy. And now she was getting married, a thought with a strange whistling sound inside of her head. Lena had become Kate's confidant. She was the first person Kate met when she actually came to Nova Scotia. Just want to fill you in on that. Lena smiled over at Kate. I married Will when I was 16. Imagine that. When did you meet? Before I can even remember. We lived 3 houses away from me, you. We were mostly tanners, see. We all knew too much about each other, that's for sure. But you fell in love with him? Oh, yes. When I was a girl, I believed Will Tannard was different from most men in Slate Harbor. He didn't drink down on the rocks with the others. He was considerate and waited for me to walk to school. I was able to tell him things, like how I thought this place was the end of the world. She fell silent and picked up her teacup then, swirling her long fingers around its rim, as though she wanted to say more, but didn't. Lena couldn't tell Kate how, when she was a child, Lena would lie in her bed in the dark and sing a little tune to the white painted walls of her room. Far better than listening to the drunk, chair-smashing racket of her father's downstairs. And how her singing took her to the far-off places, the moving Atlantic sky, past the rooftops and the steeples of the church standing against the ocean. She'd have her father's nautical maps hidden under her pillow, and she'd let the tips of her fingers rest on a choice of cities, Boston, Vancouver, San Francisco. In a chocolate wool suit and an ivory silk blouse, Lena was going to be a school teacher and walk down the aisles lined with wooden desks for her students in a place far away from Slate Harbor. Did Will want to leave too? Kate asked. Oh, yes, Lena said. Even though Will fished with his father Angus, he told me he might start a general store someday and move to Halifax. But that never happened. Kate waited again, looking at Lena. Their eyes met, and Kate blinked, feeling the intensity of whether or not she would marry Andy. She wanted to know more about Lena and Will's marriage, as if that might help her, even though she knew she had no right to ask those personal things. Kate couldn't help but imagine Will and Lena when they were young. Maybe they were 14. Perhaps they met down on the fish store when Will had told her, "You're so beautiful, Lena," and how he might have gently turned her and lifted himself on top of her. Kate wondered if Lena came alive then, with her breath and heated skin all mixed up with Will's, and if she might have mixed up this aliveness with her dreams, and then mixed up her dreams with Will. I became a fisherman's wife, Lena admitted to Kate slowly, just like my mother, though that wasn't what I wanted. You never did leave. No, Lena looked at Kate and sighed. I became pregnant with Ivan, see? So Will had to keep on fishing. For how many years? Until Ivan was 12, mind you. I was a fisherman's wife. A fisherman's wife, the woman who watched from the kitchen window for her husband to return from the wharf, who worried about his life on the treacherous sea, who worried about his mouth around the lip of a sherry bottle, his unquenchable thirst. Supper time was always the hardest time of day. Potatoes to wash and peel for the cod chowder, the plunge of hands into a bowl of water to scrub the skins down. Looking out the window, she might hope her fisherman was walking up the path, but usually he wasn't. Usually the path stared back at her with its usual emptiness, and he would be down there with the other fishermen in the abyss of their own exhaustion and light, their sacred place this time of day with the hard work done, all of them in a pack, protecting one another in their unburdening and drinking them, poisoning themselves. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Fishing is all I know, Will had told Lena. And Lena agreed to stay. But the lucky thing is the Farrells came and bought the old Tannard house. And Lena remembered watching the Farrells come to Slate Harbor while Will was in the hospital after his accident. Their large gray-blue Buick winding its way down the road, and the Farrells had picnics out on the rocks overlooking the ocean right in front of Lena's house. A tall man, a woman who always wore a hat, and a boy. And Lena guessed that boy was the same age as Ivan. Lena paused for a moment, then looked intently at Kate. I wondered what brought these people to such an isolated place. I'd always dreamed of leaving. But they bought the Tannard house, mind you, and that saved us. And your Andy is a part of that. Your Andy. Kate took a deep breath, sensing the importance of the Farrells in Will and Lena's life. And she realized at that moment that her destiny was linked with Andy's.
Thanks, Kip. So I know that part of your process with this novel was that at one point you stepped away from it for a good 10 years. And I'm curious what changed in your relationship to the book in those 10 years, and how did that time away change the book?
Yeah, well, I started the book, as I think I mentioned a little earlier, from the Nova Scotians' point of view. And it was my way of getting to know Will and Lena and Ivan. And Ivan had also a very important family member, Carl, who is Will's brother, Ivan's uncle. And so I had scenes and scenes of the Nova Scotians. And then halfway through the book, I brought in Kate and Andy, moving to their village, the inshore community. And somehow it was disjointed. And I got the interests of some different agents, but I knew there was something not quite right in these really short stories that were all kind of together. And then I started working with my mentor and dear friend, Brenda Peterson, when I moved to Seattle from Lopez. And I got my first draft out. And then Brenda recommended to Sherry Prouda that I needed a job, and Sherry was looking for someone to start an education program, Writers in the Schools. So that's when I put the book down. I had my first draft, but put it down. I did keep writing through that time that I was working at Seattle Arts and Lectures and Writers in the Schools, but it was, in little chapters. And then I did write some short stories, which was nice. I needed to write short things. So that when I did leave Writers in the Schools and I came back to the opportunity to be able to write, my wonderful agent, Ann Depew, took an interest, and she said, but Kip, I think it should start with Kate and Andy going to Nova Scotia. So there I was. I had all of this material about the Nova Scotians. I had, of course, the story in my mind of what was going to happen in Kate and Andy's narrative, but it was a large revision because I had to put a lot of the information about Carl and Will and Lena and Ivan in flashback to bring them to the present time when Andy and Kate actually did come to Nova Scotia. So that was my big revision. And I think it was, I've always felt very grateful to Anne for making that suggestion, because I think I found my authentic voice, because my story is that I was an American and I went to Nova Scotia. Even though these characters were totally fictional, I think I felt more in control. I felt more authentic writing from that point of view, already knowing the Nova Scotians.
Right, right. So I want to make sure that we meet one of those Nova Scotians. We've who's one of the main characters. So we've heard some about Lena in the excerpt that you just read, and we've met Andy and Kate, the two American protagonists. But let's meet Ivan, the complication in the love story, and a Nova Scotian himself.
Okay. It was an overcast September morning, and Ivan drove across the bridge and along the road to the tire plant, seeing Kate's face in his mind all the while, the four of them playing bridge last night, sitting around the table at the Tannard house. He parked in the lot beside the large, dreary buildings and took a deep breath, trying to wipe out that unsettled feeling, bracing himself for the sound of machines and tire building drums, the smell of rubber. He made his way to the office in the metal tasting air, his job to make sure those steel monsters spitting out wire and metal shells and casings worked all right. Not always easy. He wasn't sure why he hated his job so much. Ivan punched in his time card, hung his jacket on the hook. Men in goggles and gloves worked at the various machines, spinning out rubber and steel cords, the roar of production. He'd felt jealous of Kate at first. For years, when Andy came to Slate Harbor in the summer, it was just the two of them as boys. They'd fished in the dory, help Carl repair nets, or work on the Cape Islander, go drinking in Greenport. That's how they'd become best friends. Going back to his desk, he opened the notebook to read the notes for the machine inspections. Another long day inside this hole, he thought. The eternity of radial tires squeezed like black liquid tubes between those steel drums, that raucous thrum. Sometimes Ivan wondered if the fumes were to blame for his persistent sore throat. Kate was a beautiful woman. He would always remember how his heart came up into his throat that day she gazed out over the plowed field, both of them standing beside the tractor, how the wind blew softly against her blue cotton blouse and revealed the supple curve of her breasts, and the grace with which she swept her long hair from her face as she stepped over the dirt towards the house. He'd never seen brown eyes like hers. Usually brown eyes have a surface you can't see through, but Kate's reflected light as if they had water in them, the kind of eyes a man could get lost in. Private dreams. Across the bridge table, Ivan had been careful when looking at Kate. Even now, walking out into the gigantic space where blasts of machine rollers churned around him, he was fighting Kate's eyes. "Good morning, Ivan, buddy," another electrician yelled out across him. "Things look pretty good for the moment." Ivan tipped his cap. "Good morning," he said, putting on his goggles and gloves, wondering about these tires, round and black with their hidden interior that gives them strength. He vowed he'd never look at Kate again that way. He had that June day after plowing. He knew how much Andy loved Kate. He'd witnessed it firsthand, like on that night a few weeks ago when he had walked down to the wharf looking for his pocket knife he'd forgotten. It was already dark and the moon hung like a big globe in the sky. Ivan heard a voice like he'd never heard before, deep-pitched, almost singing. He'd walked out onto the wharf, peered around the fish store, and there, sitting together with their feet dangling over the dock, were Kate and Andy, Andy holding a book in the air, black against the moonlight. Ivan tried to bring Kate into focus. Her head was slightly raised. Were her eyes closed? She seemed entranced. He'd leaned back against the fish house and listened. "I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing to each other. I do not think they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back, when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown." In the following silence, a profound melancholy overcame Ivan. He wasn't sure why. He didn't know much about poetry and was moved by what he heard. It bothered him that Andy had never talked to him about poetry. Was it because he didn't have an education like Andy? Ivan realized there was a whole side to Andy he might never know. Often he had come to visit and found Andy reading, but he had never asked Andy anything about those books he read. All of the things missing in his life suddenly took hold of him. He loved that someone wrote about mermaids. He looked towards the reef that gleamed in the moonlight. Seals lived there, and probably now were sleeping. He heard the poem's last line, till human voices wake us and we drown.
Thank you. There's so much in the book that's related to that sense of the mysterious out in the water. And if we had more time, there are so many excerpts I'd like to ask you to read. I just want to ask a quick question about the figures that are so central to the book that they're also on the cover, and that's of course seals. And as you mentioned, there's an opening scene to the book where a seal is very important. I don't want to have any spoilers, but will you talk just a little bit about how you see I realize I'm asking all my questions from the perspective of a poet. I want to know about images and symbols. So we'll get to audience questions, but they'll probably ask other things. But will you tell us a little bit, Kip, about, so these seals keep recurring in different contexts, and that was in the scene with Andy on the fishing boat, and we got Ivan's desire to protect them there. How do you see the seals as images in this book?
I see the seal really as a form of grace. The seal mysteriously appears at times you might not expect. The opening of the book is a seal legend where Basil Tannard is actually saved out at sea when his boat gets struck by a rogue wave. And no one in the village believed that Basil was saved by a seal. They all thought he'd just gone bonkers. And so he was outcast, and he died sadly. He drowned himself because no one believed him. So for me, the seal represents, it is a form I'm asking the reader to, sort of go away with some magical realism, because the seal, in my mind, appears at kind of dangerous times for a human being, and has actually, for those who believe, can save a life, and that there's several occurrences of that in the book. And Ivan, when I read that section in the Shoal Water section, experienced that for himself, because there was a time in the book when he felt tortured because he hadn't saved his father's life, and took himself to the cave and wanted to drown, and a seal appeared and shoved him out of the cave and saved his life. So Ivan himself, even though he never talked about it to anyone, believed that a seal could save a life. An act of grace.
Yeah, that unlooked for assistance that comes when we need it most. Yeah. I want to make sure we get some of your audience's questions in. I saw earlier in your reading, Kip, there was a question, someone wanting to know, how did you become so well versed in all this fishing lore, because it's so central and it's so wonderfully detailed in the book, these scenes of fishing. We've heard a little bit in the excerpts tonight, but it's such a central part of the book. How did you develop that knowledge?
Well, I actually studied. I had to, I can't say I went out and fished. So I want to credit one of my Bibles. I have it in my acknowledgments. The Images of Lunenburg County by Peter Barse. And this book is filled with photographs and recorded interviews with many of the inshore fishermen. And I just read that book probably once a week, not the whole book, obviously, but to get the language and the feel of the place, and, the scenes. And that's really what gave me the information about fishing, lobstering, all of that. And then I also want to credit L.B. Jensen, whose book Fishermen of Nova Scotia really helped me with the fine terms. And I also want to credit my husband Stanley, who did fish for 3 years. So some of the immediate scenes, where Ivan and Andy are on the fishing boat, I got Stanley to read and really double check and make sure that it was okay, that things were in the right place and all
You
that.
got some physical verification.
Physical.
Yes. Yeah. Great. So there's also a question from your audience. Gail McCormick asks, as a first-time book author, did you have a platform that helped you attract an agent and publisher?
Oh, that's an interesting story for a writer. So I have my wonderful agent, Anne Depew, and she believed in the story, but she wasn't successful in finding me a publisher. We both learned together that it's really hard to get a publisher in the big New York world. And so I did get discouraged, but I kept the hope. And my friend Iris Gravel, who'd been published by Homebound Publications, knew about the Landmark Prize. And she said, Kip, if you want to get, the only way Homebound publishes fiction is through the Landmark Prize. And I encourage you to apply. And, I thought, oh, Iris, Shoal Water's not material for contests. I just didn't think contests would be the way Shoal Water would get published. But I kept hearing her voice in my ear. And one New Year's, I got sick and the deadline was January 2nd. And I thought, I'm just going to apply. So I got up in kind of a feverish state and I had to make the book 200 pages in long. It scrolled so that I could actually submit and then submit the book. And then, you have to have your artistic statement and your all those things that you have to do. And I applied. And much to my shock, just when the lockdown came, March 2020, I got this very low key email from Leslie Browning. And she said, I want you to know that we've received your work, Shoal Water, and I would want to let you know that you are the winner. Period. I was so excited. I called Iris and I was late and she was good enough to answer the phone. I said, I just can't believe it.
Now that is a great.
So that's my story. I would encourage people to submit to literary contests because I think you find different readers.
Yeah, it's also a great reminder about the importance of having a community of writers.
Yes.
And how important it can be to have people around you who will encourage you to put yourself out, who will tell you about an opportunity, share information with you. It's just so crucial.
Yeah.
My own path to publication has some similar aspects to it. And it's just that community is so sustaining. Yeah. I want to do a time check real quick. I think we have time for a few more audience questions. One of the questions coming in from Brenda Peterson, Kip, has to do with how this book is centered on friendship. And Brenda wants you to speak about how even that idea of a love triangle can be revealing about the nature of friendship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's very central to the book. I mean, Andy and Ivan, since they were children, were very close friends. And they, again, sort of like the Shoal Water theme, they started on the wrong foot because Ivan was mad that Andy's family bought the old Tannard house, which was his getaway when he was trying to escape his father's drunken fights with his mother. So Ivan was not happy about Andy, but they forged through it. They had all these different experiences, which are in the book, and became very good friends. So that when Andy years later came with Kate to Nova Scotia and decided to live in the Tannard house, they became friends. They were neighbors, essentially. And Ivan and his wife, Berlene, welcomed Kate and Andy into the community. And there was just what was sort of unexpected was the attraction that occurred between Ivan and Kate. Neither one of them were prepared for that. And in a way, they didn't even want it. They kind of shied away from it because of their loyalty. Andy's loyalty to Ivan, Ivan's loyalty to Andy, Verlene and Kate had their own friendship, being loyal to each other. And then really what ended up happening was, tragedy befell. Andy became alcoholic. So that increased Kate's vulnerability and sadness. And there are just some things that made them very vulnerable as young people. They were in their 20s, trying their best, raising a family. Kate and Andy started a bookstore, working very hard. And these things that just befall you in the middle of your life that you don't anticipate.
Yeah.
But the friendship was there right till the end of the book. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the driving forces of the book.
Yeah.
And it's such a pleasure the way that unfolds and the turns the book takes. Yeah. There were a couple of other questions here. Question from Kat Humphrey, who wants to know, has your Lopez experience living on Lopez Island, has it informed any of your writing about Nova Scotia? Are you translating any of that island life?
That's a great question, Kat. Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Because my parents bought an old farmhouse on Lopez when I was 14. And I experienced what it was for the native islanders to welcome city people. My dad was a professor at the University of Washington. My mother, was never worked, never held a job or anything. It was, totally different lifestyle. But so I probably created, I think Pierre Franklin on Lopez may have inspired some of what I put in Ivan for sure.
Okay.
Pierre Franklin is the farmer who sold my parents the house. And so it's just such a collage. I have to say that being a fiction writer, you just draw from so many different parts of what you know and create into this great big, collage of characteristics and physical forms. And so that part was fun, but that's I definitely was influenced by that. My parents buying the farmhouse and the Lopetians.
Great. So I think we're going to do two last questions, and I want to make sure, because this is a book about intergenerational friendships as well, I want to make sure that we get a question in from your granddaughter, Daisy.
Oh, good. I saw Daisy flash across the screen.
Yeah, because Daisy wants to know who your favorite character is.
Oh, Daisy. This is my granddaughter who wanted. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to get the giggles all of a sudden. Okay, Daisy. I can't say that I have a favorite character. I know you're always trying to get me to say my favorite, but I think these three are all equal to me, and Ivan, Kate, and Andy, and Will and Lena and Ivan. That's why I kept working on the story. That's why I could be with this story for so long. It really is kind of a love story of my own, that these characters just kept living in me. And my biggest fear when I think of writers as being really highly intelligent. I just saw last night on Seattle Arts and Lectures, Lauren Groff. And my biggest fear was that I didn't have the brain capacity to give this story justice, to give these characters their right place, that I wouldn't have the intelligence to do that. And that was my greatest fear. My shoal water, my personal shoal water. Mm-hmm. So I feel very loyal to all of the characters in the book. So we'll talk about that in the future, Daisy.
Brief follow-up question to that before I ask you what I promise will be the final question. Okay, so maybe not favorite character, but which character was the most fun to write?
Ivan, no question.
Oh, really? How so?
Absolutely. Oh, I just, I mean, that's where, again, I go back to Pierre Franklin on Lopez, affecting, my thoughts of who Ivan was. I kind of loved, he's the classic kind of grassroots man, born into a family, no privilege, no education, a tragedy in his own family with his mother literally forbidding him to go fishing, which is what he wanted to do. But he dutifully went to vocational school, became an electrician, but was miserable. Um, and I somehow identified with when you are born into something, but you want very much to do something else, that dichotomy. And Ivan really represented to me I worked in the library in Nova Scotia, in Lunenburg Library, and I was fortunate because I've got to know a lot of the Nova Scotian wives of fishermen. And, I just feel that Ivan represented for me, someone highly intelligent, the way he loves poetry and wants to know more about poetry. But he's gruff, he's a rough guy. And I just love that dichotomy.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So Kip, I know I'm not the only one that is wondering whether you have another book in the works. What are you working on? I mean, you have birthed into the world something you were gestating for 35 years. So what now?
I can't live 35 more years, that's for sure. It's a challenging question because I've done several different things with my writing. So I've got a series of stories about my experience of living at East Lee, and which is my family home, and
You're in Seattle.
in Seattle, yeah. And then I've also, you talk about having a theme. I have experienced some abuse in my family. And but being a fiction writer, I don't wish to have my family be the characters. Well, I'll probably do the same thing with the characters in my fiction that I've done with my characters in Shoal Water. Create new names, new, draw from what I know. But I'd like to write from the point of view of the mother of two daughters who've been sexually abused. And I'd like the main character not to write about them, but to write about her own experience. And it's funny, I had this thought because Shelf Awareness put Shoal Water under the romance section. And I thought, oh my gosh, I wonder if my next book is going to be a mystery murder story. So I don't know, I've got all kinds of sections written, but I'm not quite sure how it's going to manifest.
Well, we will all eagerly look forward to it. And in the meantime, I'm glad that we all have Shoal Water to read. So thank you for your persistence, Kip, in writing it, in finishing it, and getting it out into the world. And for those of you who have been with us this evening, thank you. And there's a link in the chat to be able to buy Kip's beautiful book. We hope that you'll buy it from Elliott Bay to support them for hosting this reading. Thank you so much to Karen Maeda-Allman and Rick Simonson for hosting us. Kip, anything you want to say to your audience before we bid them good night?
Well, I see that Karen is writing a lovely chat about connecting the song that Stanley and I wrote, Shoal Water, to this live recording. So that'll be wonderful. I'll love that. And I want to thank you so much, Elizabeth, for doing this. It's just made the difference for me. And Rick, your introduction, I felt like all the years became one day.
Yeah, they are. If we were in the room right now, there would be that jostle because you'd have some people there hanging on to your every last word, others angling to get in to be first in line to get their book signed in the back of the room. We've been there and seen that and known that. I saw a comment think it was a sideways comment, but it's with you in mind, Kip. It was from Sherry thanking Brenda
Yeah,
for introducing you to her and
yeah.
changing her life personally and professionally. The other thing to follow up on Elizabeth's last part about the other work, we had a couple weeks ago, we had Margaret Randall on this. She's got at least 10 years on you, and she's doing 3 books a year.
Oh my
So,
God.
so
Okay.
it'll get looser and as you get going here. I think hopefully these stories will start
Be a
coming.
little
Like, what
quicker.
am I waiting for? And I think that's part of it, the release and letting it go and making it happen. So, and hopefully there will, maybe not that level of prolificness every year, but thank you, but more, please. To everyone who's been with us, thank you so much. The energy has been palpable, even with these screens, and your comments, including the ones kind of rushing in here at the end as we conclude. Kip will get to read because we'll save the chat and it'll get passed on. And if
Oh,
you have,
good.
some of you we know had a little trouble getting in, so you missed some of this, or people, and including there are probably some people in Nova Scotia who've heard about this and realize what time this meant for them in the evening. It will be posted on our YouTube, and I think it's also Facebook places.
Oh,
So
okay.
people will get to see these and catch up and keep in touch. And Elizabeth, great and wonderful. You've done this beautifully before, and you've done it so much tonight with Kip. And your role isn't to be overlooked. It's a generous spirited. You helped draw Kip out. I think Kip would have been fine, but the whole thing had a grace and ease. I think that it was just that part was delightful too. And Kip, well done. Thanks. You're
Thank you.
onto it now,
Thank
and I think you
Thank you
have a
so
little
much.
going out planned. Is that you can at least do that now. You can't couldn't do it a year ago. So
Thank
to
you,
everyone,
Rick. I
what?
love our history. I thank you so much.
Well, there is history. Yes. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you everyone who's been with us.
All right.
Yeah. Good night.
Thank you,
Good
Kip.
night.
Thank you all.
Thank you,
Good
Elizabeth.
night.
Thanks, Stanley, too. Yes.
Bye-bye.